Greetings, WHAP Warriors. Brad Anderson here, coming to you from my home office. Today's lesson is about classical Greece. And so this is a review of the finer points that we went over in class that you've read about and perhaps studied on your own in depth. So just to go back over these points that hopefully you have a solid foundation of and an understanding moving forward. If you've been absent for whatever reason, if you're out for whatever reason, this is a great video to watch and rewatch as you move forward. So I'm going to move my picture up here to the upper right side of the screen so that I can give you the review. So let's first off, we'll talk about the fact that the golden age of Greece is the 400s and 300s, the 5th and 4th centuries. BCE is really when you refer to classical Greece or you talk about the golden age of Greece, when you think Socrates, Parthenon, Battle of Marathon, it's the 400s and 300s BCE. Greece was a mountainous terrain tucked in a peninsula into the Aegean Sea, into the Mediterranean Sea. It was a series of city-states it was a patchwork of these city-states that sometimes would come together for trading purposes or political purposes or military purposes in order to repel a much larger adversary, which I'll talk about here in just a moment. But for the most part, these city-states were, they shared a culture, they shared a common language, a common ancestry for the most part, and religion. But the city-states were largely self-sustaining, right? A city-state was a powerful city that controlled the surrounding villages and the surrounding towns. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the more prominent of those city-states here in a moment. There were also seafaring people. As you can see on a map earlier in the week that I showed you, that the Greeks were surrounded by water, and in many cases you're on islands, and I'm sure that there was plenty of fish in the diet, as well as goat cheese and wine. Moving forward, Sparta and Athens were rivals. These are the two most prominent, powerful cities. For the most part, you are going to have from time to time, it's going to be Corinth or Thebes, and there's going to be some jockeying for position there. But for the most part, when you think of classical Greece, you're thinking of Athens, you're thinking of Sparta, and they were rivals much in the way, Michigan State, the New York Yankees, Boston Red Sox, Detroit Lions, Bears. I don't know if that's an appropriate analogy, though. Anyways, Athens, when you think of Athens, you think of democracy. They were the cradle of democracy, where landowning male citizens would have a say in the matters of state through a voting process. They would vote for important matters of state, and they had a say in their government and how they were governed and how their community was ran. There was also a focus on the arts and philosophy. Some of the great philosophers and thinkers like Socrates and Plato, who was the author of the Republic, as well as Aristotle, were, when you think of Athens, these were Athenian thinkers. But the model that we talked about of the greatest Athenian of this time period, at least in my humble opinion, is Pericles, who was the first citizen, so to speak, who would famously deliver his funeral oration after the first year of the Peloponnesian War. And instead of focusing in on those who had died and their deeds, he instead decided to focus on the virtues of democratic Athens and talk about the way of life, and kind of rubbed it a little bit in the Spartans, really without saying their name. And then you have Sparta, which is a monarchy, and in some cases a dual monarchy. It was a warrior society, young men trained in the agoge from the age of 7 or 8 all the way up to the age of 20, rugged communal style training where they ate with their fellow soldiers until the age of 30, and they trained to become virtually the ultimate warriors of the ancient world. They were disciplined, and the greatest of all, at least again in my opinion, is Leonidas, who famously would lead 300 Spartans to Thermopylae to hold the pass against Persians during the Greco-Persian Wars. and would perish in his attempt to hold them back. They did fight against each other, Sparta and Athens, in the Peloponnesian War, a prolonged war where Athens originally had the upper hand, but then Sparta would come out as the victors of this war in 404 BCE and be the predominant power in Greece afterwards. The Greco-Persian Wars, 498 to 448 BC, again is a multi-generational effort against the Persians, who attempted a few times to invade, and did in some cases actually invade, mainland Greece. The Greeks, for the most of Persian history, were kind of an afterthought, kind of on the fringes of the Persian Empire, but a thorn in the side nonetheless of the Persians, and it would be a Macedonian product of Greek training and Greek schooling that would actually be the doom of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Greco-Persian Wars, the Persians were led by King Darius the Great and King Xerxes in an effort to subjugate the Greeks. At the Battle of Marathon, the Athenians, famously as underdogs, were able to repel the Persian advance in 490 BCE, and the messenger made his way back to Athens and shouted, "Victory, victory, victory," and then collapsed and died. And that is why we get our 26.2-mile marathon run. The Parthenon was built in celebration of this victory, and it is a famous architectural feat and very much a symbol of Western democracy and the cradle of that Western democracy in Athens. Very memorable. The Battle of Thermopylae was a Persian victory, but it is seen by Western standards as a kind of an underdog moral victory led by King Leonidas in a phalanx battle that held the gates of Thermopylae, which literally translates as the hot gates, thermo and pylai, Greek for hot gates. And it was a thin strip of land along Mount Koliodromos, and on the sea at the Straits of Artemisium, an Athenian, Themistocles, was battling the Persian fleet and successfully did so. On land, Leonidas had to hold them back, and he, along with the 300 Spartans, famously stalled the Persians for 3 days, but ended up dying to a last person on the final day of the battle. But not without some great moments for the Spartans. One of the most famous lines, of course, is when a Persian emissary says, "Lay down your weapons, go home, surrender. Our arrows are so many they will block out the sun." To which Leonidas' assistant, Dionychus, replied, "Then we shall fight in the shade," which is a great attitude. And the Spartans very much had a with it or on it attitude, which comes from a story that I told in class about how the mother famously handed the shield to her young son about to head off into his first battle and said, "Come back with your shield or come back on it." And that's where I get my class motto. It's the attitude that the Spartans would then take into battle, and it became kind of a calling card, with it or on it. And so that's why that, along with the lambda shield of the Spartans, is our class symbol and class motto, with it or on it. The Greeks in battle fought largely in a phalanx interlocking hoplon shield formation, and it was suited to the narrow mountain valleys of Greece, where you think of like a football field size area. You could it would be a front on front battle, and it was the army that could maintain their position, hold the line, and withstand the collision. I like to think about it, a phalanx is kind of like an armored not hedgehog, porcupine, an armored porcupine kind of moving forward at you. And this phalanx was very successful at, again, I said, at Thermopylae for 3 days, holding back a much larger Persian force that should have, by all accounts, crushed the Spartans, but they were able to use the phalanx to their advantage. If you were fighting in the phalanx, you had a panoply or equipment, and hoplite, which was a heavy infantry soldier in the Greek militaries, or a citizen soldier essentially, except for the Spartans, who were full-time warriors. But the panoply of a hoplite included the hoplon shield, which I showed you in class, the dory spear, the 6 to 8 foot long spear. You can actually see some dory spears behind you if you look right there. You see some of my dory spears that I've used to train for the Spartan races. You'll get a demonstration later on in the fall. You have the Xiphos sword, the short sword, Corinthian helmet, and lamellar bronze and leather armor. And so the strategos was the general or king that would lead the citizen soldiers, the hoplites, into battle, and they were on the far right corner of an advancing phalanx, and so the most exposed. Because the idea of a hoplon shield was to use the argive handle, and the left side of the shield next to me would guard my shoulder, holding my spear, and then my shield would guard the right shoulder of the person next to me. And so in this way, you had to work together. It was a lot about, it was teamwork. It was collaboration and coordination and communication when moving in a phalanx. And so the strategos, as exposed as they were, oftentimes the kings, the generals, the strategos, would live they had a fairly short battlefield life expectancy, as you can imagine, being the most exposed. Anyhow, that is our review of classical Greece. Of course, I've left out, a lot of the things that we talked about, a lot of the little details we talked about in class, but that's why it's so important to take accurate notes. Make sure that when you're doing the reading guide that you're also gleaning as much as you can from the reading guide, because quite frankly, in a college-style format, there's things I'm going to talk about in class, there's things that we're going to watch, and there's things that you're going to read that don't always, we can't cover everything twice or thrice. And so that's why it is critical that you read and that you answer the reading guide, you do the charts in your journal so that you can keep up, so that when I talk about these things, it isn't the first time you've heard it for the most part. Obviously, some of my stories, some of my little nitty-gritty details, it might be the first time, but the big stuff you should have read and seen in class. So anyhow, signing off. This week we're going to do it a little bit different. So if you're watching this as a remote learning lesson, you're going to be reading the first day this week, and then reading out of the text PDF, and then later on in the week you're going to be doing a primary source analysis. So hope to see you this week, cohort A, cohort B. Hope you had a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.